Hello and welcome to the Wednesday edition of Katrina's Creations. Now today is going to be something a little different than normal. It is not going to be fiber or knitting or crochet related, but I thought it would be kind of an interesting story. On the bookmobile that I work on, part of our day we run between two different stops and we cut across the Springfield State Hospital grounds. And I thought I would take some footage for you because it's a very interesting property and it has a very interesting history. And we saw some bald eagles while we were cutting across. So it's a little shortcut that we go through, like I said, between stops. And when I was filming, I just thought it would be kind of interesting to share with you guys. So let me tell you a little bit about it. The Springfield State Hospital, it was a mental hospital. It was originally an estate owned by a man named William Patterson. He was a blockade runner during the American Revolution. So he bought this property in 1778, and 6 years later, his daughter was born. His daughter's name was Elizabeth. They called her Betsy. And when she was 18 years old in 1804, she married the youngest brother of Napoleon Bonaparte. His name was Jerome, and the land was given to her by her father as a dowry. Napoleon was not real happy about the connection with an American, and so he insisted that his brother have the marriage annulled because he wanted his brother to marry a royal princess so that he could have a political marriage to strengthen some political ties. So the marriage was annulled, except that Betsy was already pregnant. And so he abandoned her, and Betsy went on to have this child and raise him on her own. Her son's name was Jerome Napoleon Bonaparte, and he was born in 1805. And he lived until 1870. Now, Betsy outlived her son by 9 years. She lived until 1879. When she passed away, the land sat idle for quite a few years until 1894, when the state of Maryland needed more property to build more mental institutions because the other one that they had in the area was overflowing. So they bought the property for $50,000, and at that time it was over 1,000 acres. It's now down to, I'm guessing, a little over 100 acres at this point. The buildings were started immediately. They renovated some of the existing buildings that were already on site, and the men's dormitories where they lived were on one end of the campus, and the women's dorms were on the other. Now, when the hospital was originally built, the wealthy insane lived there. As a result, the houses inside these buildings that you're going to see, you can see from the video how elaborate they are. Now, they are abandoned. They've been abandoned for years, for almost, I think, 30 years now. So they are falling apart, but you can see what they were like in their grandeur. They had mahogany staircases inside and murals. You can still see the semicircular verandas on the front porch, which is like the front porch with these big stained glass fan lights over the front doors. And there are colonnades running between the buildings so that the residents that live there could travel from one building to the next without having to be exposed to the weather. Some of the buildings that you're going to see had auditoriums in them that were later turned into movie theaters. And it was a pretty elaborate network of buildings. The ones you're going to see were built in 1900. And the hospital ran very well up until the 1930s. But during the 1930s, with the Depression and overcrowding, it began going downhill. The majority of the buildings on the campus were closed in the late 1980s. So they have been sitting abandoned. They are gradually renovating some of the buildings, but there is a lot of lead and asbestos in them. So there are some that you'll see cars parked in front of, and those are ones that have been redone on the inside. The property itself was originally intended to be run as a self-sustaining farm. So when it first opened, they had fields, they had barns, they had livestock. There's a root cellar, there's a fire company, and they even had their own powerhouse for electricity. The staff lived right on site. In fact, some of the buildings are still marked for staff. And the one building we used to go to, you will not see this in the video, it's on the other end of the campus, but we used to visit the library to drop materials off. And I noticed when I went in there one day that it really looked kind of odd because it had little half walls like stalls throughout the one room, and they were like tiled. And I thought, well, what was this room? And the librarian told me that it's kind of creepy, but this is where the lobotomies were performed. And apparently one of the more famous lobotomists in the country did surgeries here at this hospital. So there's also a cemetery on site called the Sunnyside Cemetery, and there are over 900 graves there. They were unmarked up until 2012. Before that, the patients just were given a number, and so it's just numbers on their grave sites. But in 2012, there was a group that came in and tried to put a name attached to the number so they could identify who was buried there. There are now only about 250 patients. There are still some operational buildings on site, but they're on the other end of the property. So the area that we're driving through, for the most part, is all abandoned. And there have been some movies that have been filmed at Springfield State Hospital. One of them was one of the series from Hannibal Lecter. I don't think it was Silence of the Lambs, but I'm not sure. It's one of the series that was in there. Was filmed in the basement of one of the buildings. And apparently one of the movies in the Species series was also filmed there. There are colonnades that run between the buildings so that the residents did not get wet going from one building to the next. Because the cafeteria was in one building, an auditorium was in another building. And apparently those colonnades were used during one of the movies. It's also an area that is known for a Bigfoot sighting. Actually, quite a few Bigfoot sightings. I grew up in this area. In fact, I went to middle school right over the hill from where Springfield State Hospital is. And we lived about 3 miles away. And we moved there when I was 10 years old in 1973. And all of a sudden there were these sightings of what they called the Sykesville Monster, which was a Bigfoot Sasquatch type of character. The hospital itself has a lot of open areas, and it backs up to a state park, and it also backs up to the Patapsco River. So there is a lot of open, uninhabited areas, and that's where this creature was spotted. Up until, I think, 1981 was the last sighting. So, and you can Google it if you want to learn more about the Sykesville Monster. Just check it out. There's lots of stuff on it. So that was kind of interesting. Yeah, there's also a lot of wildlife on this property because it is a lot of vast open areas. We actually saw some bald eagles the day we cut through there. We've seen up to like 30 deer, an entire herd of deer grazing there, which is really funny because there's a state police driving academy where they can practice their high-speed driving and things. You'll actually see it in some of the videos if you see flashing lights. They actually were over practicing their driving at the time. But it doesn't seem to scare the deer or anything. They hang back and they're just there with all of the chaos going on. So anyway, with that, I will let the video roll, and I hope you enjoy it.